Westone here. In this video, I'm going to explain basic soil health principles using the Soils in Sync infographic, which is a soil health reference tool that I've created that explains how to feed your specific crop exactly what it prefers. Each family of crops prefer a specific diet, so to speak. The infographic easily displays this information and more, and helps you to synchronize your soil microbiology with the soil macrobiology according to the ecosystem succession to optimize crop performance. That all sounds complicated. I can assure you it's not. An introduction. Here's the first look at the infographic. This infographic brings several previously disjointed agronomic concepts into coherence in a very simple way. I'm going to break it down piece by piece to explain what it is and how to use it. Do a quick overview of the infographic with a quick explanation. Some of these concepts are well known and others are not so well known, and this infographic is a work in progress. So I intend to update versions as they develop. You can see the version number here at the top. You can find the latest version on the Soils in Sync Facebook page, which I have a QR code link to down here at the bottom. Just a quick look at the chart headings. In green here we have a quick look at the ecosystem succession. In blue we have our crop's preference, where it prefers to be along the ecosystem succession. We have compost and mulch materials aligned with their carbon to nitrogen ratios, as well as cover crop residues and their corresponding fungal-to-bacterial decomposer ratio, as well as the approximate soil pH. I've listed these soil health principles here so that they're always available at a glance. And this whole infographic, this whole program is centered around soil health principles and helping us to achieve soil health principles organically. We'll delve into these principles later. And then just some basic instructions for how to use this chart. And again, we'll be digging into this stuff later. So I'm going to explain this infographic in the simplest terms possible, because it really is pretty simple. What this infographic tells you is, if you're trying to grow grass, feed the soil dead grass. If you're trying to grow wood, feed the soil dead wood. Back to the chart. So in practice, what that means is that we're going to follow the instructions here. Find the crop we're trying to grow. Let's say we're trying to grow orchard trees. Step 2, feed the crop with compost, mulch, or cover crop residues from the brown and red sections that vertically align with it. Okay. Find orchard trees. What vertically aligns with it? Well, there really aren't any cover crop residues that align with it, but we do have mixed arborist wood chips. Orchard trees are going to do best when mulched with a mixed arborist wood chip. And what that means is mixed arborist wood chips are wood chips plus bark plus leaves plus tender branches, which is distinctly different from wood shavings, pure wood shavings, or sawdust. In another example, we find the crop we're trying to grow in the blue section, brassicas, for example. We're going to feed our brassicas with compost, mulch, or cover crop residues that vertically align with it from the brown and red section. All right, looks like I have lots of options here. Let's see, I have the choice of grass clippings, coffee grounds, or maybe some kind of manure. So if I'm trying to grow brassicas, those types of mulches and compost materials would be a good base to feed our brassicas. The end. That's really all there is to it. Nah, OMG, I'm JKLOL. All right, now we'll go into the over-explained version and dive a little bit deeper into the why and how and all that good stuff. First, I'll start with some basics. Soil is made up of about 45% minerals, 25% air, 25% water, and 1 to 10% organic matter. The mineral component is made up of sand, silt, and clay. The ratio between sand, silt, and clay is known as your soil texture. Soil texture varies everywhere you go. Even in my own neighborhood, my 2 gardens across the street from each other have very different soil textures and require very different management strategies. We'll circle back to this toward the end of the presentation. You can do a simple test of your soil texture by filling a jar half full of your soil and half full of water, shaking it, and watching how it settles out. It'll give you a rough idea of your aggregate composition. Then you can geek out further by classifying it on this fancy triangle. Check out the image links for more information. The next component is organic matter. This is the dead stuff that's breaking down in our soils. The act of mulching, composting, and cover cropping adds organic matter to the soil. This is the black gold we want in our soils that's responsible for everything good. The answer to how much organic matter we want is usually more. But there are limits. For reference, many deficient agricultural fields contain about 2% organic matter. 5% would be much healthier. 10 to 12% is about as high as it gets in native pastures. Your soil is like a digestive system. It can only break material down at a certain rate, and much of it turns to CO2 or water. So like you, even though you keep eating, you don't infinitely accumulate body mass. Soil organic matter generally finds a healthy equilibrium. Organic matter is the smallest component of the soil, but has a significant impact. Most of the Soils in Sync presentation will center around the organic matter component. Back to the infographic. The first section shows ecosystem succession. We need to understand what nature does all on its own, over time, naturally. And then we can manipulate that process through our management, or harmonize our efforts with natural processes. Ecosystem succession shows us the changes in an ecosystem following some kind of disturbance. Let's say we're starting with bare exposed rock. One of the first organisms that might come along are lichens and mosses. These will start to break down the minerals in the rock and make them bioavailable. And they'll sort of jumpstart the biological process. When those lichens and mosses die off, they accumulate organic matter and nutrients for the next generation of plants to feed off of. Following those are what we might consider to be broadleaf pioneer weeds. The goal of broadleaves are to cover the soil biology with their broad leaves so that the soil is not baking in the sun, and also to capture as much solar energy as possible. They tend to come in when the soil is disturbed, and because the soil doesn't like to be exposed. Nature's way of covering the soil is through these broadleaf pioneer weeds. Following those pioneer weeds, they'll die off, more organic matter will accumulate, and then we start to see things like early successional grasses, herbs, and forbs, followed by late successional grasses, herbs, and forbs. Now the goal for you in your specific location is to be able to identify plants within these generic categories so that you can better identify where your soil is along the ecosystem succession. Depending on the ecosystem, it may progress further into a more woody ecosystem, starting with shrubs, bushes, and vines, followed by an immature forest, a mature forest, and a climax forest. Again, as each generation of plants dies, the dead material feeds the next succession of plants. And that particular organic matter leaves a specific residue that feeds the next succession. Now, as the ecosystem progresses, it's easy to see how the macrobiology changes. We can obviously see the stuff that's going on above ground, but it's not easy to see how the microbiology changes below ground. But both the macro and microbiology change in sync with each other and help to feed and support each other. Ecosystem processes happen in both directions. We may see some kind of disturbance like a fire, a tornado, or in the case of agriculture, that could be clear cutting, tillage, or grazing animals, and this will actually set the ecosystem backwards. So this is what happens naturally to ecosystems all on their own over time, and we're going to learn how we can manipulate that process to suit our intended crops. In the blue section, we add common agricultural crops to the chart. Ancestors of domesticated plants developed at a certain point within the ecosystem succession. Our goal as food producers is to synchronize our crops with their ideal place within the ecosystem, hence soils in sync. Our crops are going to be more productive and resilient and overall more efficient when grown in the correct place within the succession. Plants have an ideal diet, so to speak, within the soil that is provided to them by the conditions within that ecosystem. Again, as plants die off, their dead carcass leaves a particular residue that specifically feeds the next generation of plants. And we're going to learn how we can more precisely feed our crops what they need organically. This is a sort of new, not well understood part of the infographic that could use some refinement. This is a work in progress, and you can find the latest version of the Soils in Sync infographic on the Facebook page. So, as you can see, I've listed veggies by their family name. On this slide, I've alphabetized them by common names so you can look up their respective family name. You can also search Britannica for plant family names. However, you may want to double check because some resources are inaccurate. In the next sections, we add compost, mulch, and cover crop residues. The dead waste leaves a particular carbon to nitrogen residue when breaking down that our particular crops prefer to feed off of. Now, we as humans have the luxury of being able to move these materials around and apply them to our soils intentionally to influence the direction of ecosystem succession to suit our intended crop. So we can create recipes which combine these materials to provide an ideal balanced diet for our intended crops. Now, that sounds harder than it really is, and this really isn't anything new. It's just maybe a different way of thinking about it. All of these materials are aligned in a logical way. For instance, grass clippings are aligned with a grassland ecosystem. Mixed arborist wood chips are produced by dying trees or dead trees, which align with the forest ecosystem. Raspberries, blueberries, grapes, those shrubs, bushes, and vines are somewhere in the intermediate ecosystem. Now, I mentioned a carbon to nitrogen residue, so if we're going to be making recipes to feed our plants, we should have some unit of measurement to assign to these materials. And we're going to use the carbon to nitrogen ratio as a numerical reference. Now, technically what this means is the number of parts carbon to the number of parts nitrogen within organic material. But this is more of an art than a science, since measuring that in the field is very difficult and impractical. Again, this is more of a numerical reference than a measurable unit. So the compost and mulch materials, as well as the cover crop residues, are all aligned with their respective carbon to nitrogen ratios. This is a very well understood science. However, it still can be somewhat imprecise. As a reference point, conventional literature recommends that garden compost be approximately 30-1, which is a good average target to shoot for, since most row crops and garden crops prefer to be within that area. That's why I have this white line highlighted here at 30-1. This line also delineates two categories of materials. To the left of this line, we have what we call green materials. To the right of this line, we have what we call brown materials. Green materials promote lush, leafy growth. These are more nitrogen-based materials. The brown materials are more carbon-based materials. Think leaves, straw, or wood. Experienced composters must understand the carbon to nitrogen ratio when mixing compost piles. But it applies beyond just compost piles. It applies to our soils as well, since composting is essentially creating the organic matter component of the soil. So we also need to think of our soils in terms of carbon to nitrogen ratios and be able to estimate our soil's carbon to nitrogen ratio. This is an underappreciated idea, I think. Furthermore, We also need to think of our crop's preference in terms of carbon to nitrogen ratios. This is a new idea that to me is profoundly helpful, and that is why there is less available data for the blue section of the chart. I've compiled as many resources as I could to estimate this section, but there's definitely room for improvement. To the next point, specific microbes are required to break down these brown versus green materials. Enter the fungal-to-bacterial ratio, and this is based on the work of Dr. Elaine Ingham. Bacteria and fungi are the most basic decomposers. Bacteria tend to eat low carbon to nitrogen materials, or green materials. These are your sugars, starches, proteins, easy stuff to break down. Fungi like to eat high carbon to nitrogen materials. These are your brown materials. This is your lignin, straw, wood, etc. Tough stuff to break down. That's why mushrooms are often found in a shady, damp forest, because fungi are breaking down that dead wood. Bacteria have a hard time doing so. Typically, both fungi and bacteria are present, but in different ratios. Both the carbon to nitrogen ratio and fungal to bacterial ratio correspond directly. Both ratios increase over time as ecosystems progress. Over time, we move toward greater carbon density as lush plants turn to straw, and then brushy plants drop leaves and branches, which then feed the tree trunks of a forest ecosystem. So this is what I mean when I say that not only does the macrobiology change with the ecosystem succession, but so does the microbiology. Because as the carbon density increases, it takes more and more fungi to break those materials down. Let's take a quick look at these yellow boxes on the side of the infographic. On the left side, I've noted that these are the green materials, and on the right side, I've noted these are brown materials. When bacteria break things down, they produce the nitrate form of nitrogen, which has an alkalizing pH effect. When fungi break down high carbon materials, they produce an ammonium form of nitrogen, which has an acidifying effect, as acids are required to break down those tough carbon-dense materials. One thing to note is that nitrates are very leachable. So some is always wasted to groundwater and some is wasted to surface runoff. That's neither good nor bad, but something to keep in mind as a management strategy. That leaching of nitrates is what helps to push the ecosystem succession forward. And your level of nitrates will vary based on how much rainfall you've had. Ammonium, on the other hand, does not leach easily. So we've talked about soil pH. Let's look at that for a minute. I've added approximate soil pH to the chart. This is admittedly an imperfect fit, but I believe that the general approximation holds true. Obviously, the soil parent material varies across the planet, and parent material affects soil pH. But biological activity also affects soil pH. Acidic soil tends to be associated with woody ecosystems, and neutral soils associated with agricultural systems or open prairies. The first study that I have cited is quoted as saying that soil pH consistently declined after forestation, no matter if the forest was established naturally or by planting, on croplands or grasslands. The second study I have cited defined the coefficient of determination between soil pH and ecosystem succession as about 0.45. Here's how I would translate that into layman's terms. Ecosystem succession is responsible for about half of the influence on soil pH. The other 50% could be due to factors like parent material, climate, or other factors. Now that's just one study, and that 0.45 R squared is probably as good as a guess, but there isn't much research in this area that I was able to uncover. So let's look at some anecdotal evidence. Here's a Google Earth screenshot compared to a soil pH map. Note how the forested dark green areas on Google Earth are strongly correlated to the red areas on the soil pH map. Red areas indicate acidic soils. Note the Appalachian region and the Northwoods region of Minnesota and Wisconsin, as well as the Pacific Northwest. Note how the breadbasket region of the country are correlated to a fairly neutral pH. Note how the barren parts of the country are correlated to the alkaline or blue sections of the map. Same with South America. Note how the Amazon rainforest has highly acidic soils where the top arrow is located. The two bottom arrows indicate agricultural areas of Paraguay and Uruguay. So the question is the ecosystem dependent on the parent material soil pH? Or does the ecosystem create the soil pH? The previously cited study indicated that it's about 50-50. Climate and rainfall also play a role in how rapid biological processes can happen, and therefore how effectively the biology can alter the soil pH, but further research will be needed. Either way, there's a clear correlation. So the options for adjusting soil pH are: select a crop suited for your existing soil, adjust the parent material with lime or sulfur, or adjust the organic matter component with mulches and compost. The goal would be to align all three of these with the path of least resistance. To review, back to my oversimplified example. Feed grass, dead grass. For example, if you're trying to grow a cattle pasture, you'd probably want to import and unroll some hay bales on it to get some cattle to eat it. If you're starting with unproductive duff pasture, your starting position on the ecosystem succession is probably about 60 or 80 to 1. Grass prefers to be in the 20 to 50 to 1 area, so we need to shift the succession backwards. Urine from the cattle provides a concentrated nitrogen, which will benefit the grass. Manure from the cattle is dead grass amplified and will shift your soil carbon to nitrogen to the left as well. The uneaten grass bits from the hay will also feed your soil and shift your soil carbon to nitrogen ratio to the left. The trampling and disturbance from the cattle will also shift your soil succession backwards. And the wasted straw will offset some of this leftward shift by adding some higher carbon material to the mix, as well as the presumably higher carbon material that already exists in your duff pasture. So this is how you jumpstart and invigorate a tired pasture. If you're trying to grow an orchard, mulch with wood chips and leaves. Import them onto your farm as much as possible. This study by Bryant Sharon-Brock and Gary Watson demonstrate that wood chip mulch produced the greatest tree biomass growth compared to finished compost, fertilizer, aerated compost tea, and commercial biological product. Think about that. Wood chip mulch worked better than a rich garden-type compost for trees, and better than a nitrogen fertilizer. Did those things help? Yes, but by far the best option was wood chips. That could save you a lot of time and energy and money simply by knowing that fact and produce dramatically better results for you in the end. In an orchard operation, this is dramatic. The Soils in Sync infographic has optimized this information for not only trees, but for most common agricultural crops. And the infographic is easy to use. If you feed your trees their favorite food, they will feed you more of your favorite food. But altering the ecosystem is expensive. Importing materials can be expensive. However, doing so can be worth your while because of increased production. Because your crops do need to eat, so you do have to feed them. Feed them according to the Soils in Sync infographic. But what you grow is constrained by the fertility that you can acquire. So rule number 1 is to grow what already wants to grow. less inputs will be required. I live in the northern Great Lakes forest bioregion, or what we call the Northwoods, shown in the circle. Because I live in this background ecology, tree leaves and wood chips are relatively easy to acquire for my garden. There's very little livestock produced in my local area because the long, harsh, deep snow winters make doing so impractical. So my bottleneck for my garden fertility is nitrogen. Nitrogen-loving crops grow just fine when I can find enough nitrogen, but I am in effect constrained by my background ecology. So I have a much easier time growing crops that thrive on a tree leaf-based compost. Brassicas grow great when I can get manure-based compost from the local dairy, but I'm kind of cheap and I don't really want to pay for it. Tree leaves and wood chips I can get for free. There happens to be a large number of orchardists in my area because those crops do well. It's no coincidence that orchard trees tend to grow well in a background ecology where trees grow well. This YouTube channel will offer lots of other real-world, in-the-field examples, so I hope you'll consider checking those videos out as well. All right, so I've introduced the infographic and the basics for how it works. Let's look at a few other applications for this infographic, some of which I've alluded to already. This infographic can help to create a more tailored or custom compost recipe to suit your specific crop. It doesn't need to be overly complicated. If I'm trying to grow brassicas, for instance, I can start with a manure-based compost and add carbon as needed. I can use urine as a nitrogen fertilizer to give them a boost if need be. If I'm trying to grow something like lettuce or carrots, I might be inclined to start with a leaf base for my compost and add nitrogen incrementally to it. For the stuff in the middle here, an even mix of brown and green material should do the trick. So rule number 1 is to grow what already wants to grow. This can help you select the ideal crop for your property or select the ideal property for your crop. Where is your property located in the ecosystem succession? What is the background ecology? What's the historical ecosystem? What grew there before mankind's agriculture? What is already growing abundantly in wild areas? What fertility resources are readily available? Can you, with minimal effort, maintain the soil ecosystem that suits your intended crop? On a smaller scale, you could locate specific crops at strategic places within the property. At scale, though, it becomes increasingly important to make sure you're growing the right crop in the right place because it becomes more difficult to alter the soil ecosystem. Let me tell you a story from my own experience. When I was first getting into regenerative agriculture, I wanted to learn how to raise grass-finished beef. I went to work for a guy who owned cattle and property in central Wisconsin within the circle on the map. It was smack dab in the middle of a large forested ecosystem, much of which was public land. Half of our property was forested or had been clear-cut several years prior to me arriving. We did daily cattle moves from paddock to paddock, but oftentimes I would be dumping the herd into a 40-acre woodlot or into a recently clear-cut woodlot, which by now was already producing brush and 20-foot-high tree shoots and very little quality grass. The plan was to turn these woodlots into pasture. We were correctly advised to keep returning our cattle to these, quote, paddocks, as their disturbance, urine, and manure would help to encourage grass growth and discourage woody growth. Overwintering and unrolling hay bales in these woodlots was also good advice, and that's what we did. And there were definitely areas that began to produce grass, including those overwintered areas. However, there are several practical issues with this plan. The clear-cut areas involved several hundred acres, which was way too much land for the size of our herd to have a meaningful impact. Secondly, by the time I got there, the brush was already so overgrown that we were way behind in keeping up with it, requiring further mechanical brush control. Thirdly, driving a tractor and unrolling hay bales over this branch and log and pothole-ridden terrain caused a lot of tractor issues. The point I'm trying to make is that yes, you can alter the ecosystem, in our case from a forest to a pasture, but such an extreme leap requires a tremendous amount of time, energy, and expense. So you have to decide in your business case if you are able to do that economically. Perhaps it's just easier and more economical to produce cattle where pastures already exist. I know I certainly didn't have any fun during those couple of years. This is an extreme example, but it illustrates rule number 1. Grow what already wants to grow. Another application for this infographic is to assist with basic soil testing. Here are a few basic tests of the key points we're looking for. What is your background ecology? What's your local bioregion, your biome? I already mentioned some of these. What plants already want to grow? What plants are thriving in wild areas? The other major factor is soil organic matter. We can test this by visually inspecting the soil. Is the soil very dark brown in color or almost black in color? That would indicate high organic matter. Is there a high worm population? Worms feed on organic matter, so more worms means more organic matter. However, if you see organic matter but no worms, this could be an indication of some sort of synthetic product having killed them off. Do you see decaying organic matter on top of the soil or within the soil? Does your soil have a good texture or aggregate, similar to like a crumbly cheese? How does your soil smell? Does it smell fresh and earthy? That would indicate that it's biologically active and probably high in organic matter. Does your soil have no smell? Could just be lifeless dirt with little to no biological activity happening. Is your soil stinky? It could be anaerobic, which means it lacks airflow. It could be too wet, and that stinky smell is probably putrefying organic matter. You can estimate your soil's carbon to nitrogen ratio, assuming you have significant organic matter, by seeing how long it takes for brown materials to break down in your soil. If you have a leaf, straw, or corn stalk mulch, how long does it take to break down? This can indicate what your carbon to nitrogen ratio is, or if you're lacking nitrogen or have too much nitrogen. We'll talk more about this in an upcoming section. Are grasses growing vigorously? Is brush creeping in? Are plants lush and vibrant? Or are plants tall and stocky and kind of straw-like? These questions can help assess your approximate carbon to nitrogen ratio and ecosystem succession. Conventional thinking is obsessed with soil pH. It's the foundation on which much literature is seemingly based. Testing soil pH is pretty cheap and easy, so if you know it, great. It can help to determine where your soil is in the succession. However, many resources like to list plant preferences by pH. I find that thinking about plant preferences in terms of carbon to nitrogen ratio is much more helpful and much easier to manipulate through mulches. Thinking about soil in terms of pH makes it sound scientific and abstract, and leads me down the wrong path toward altering my soil pH, potentially. Where I live in the Northwoods, I see piles of lime outside of some hay fields. As far as I can tell, what they really need is nitrogen to invigorate their soils. Since livestock are mostly absent from my area, that may be impractical. Alternatively, they could stop trying to grow grass and hay and try to grow something further along the ecosystem succession. But in my opinion, lime probably isn't the answer for guys in my area. Another way we can test our soil is through indicator species. Weeds can tell us a story if we're willing to listen. Learning to identify local plants in your area and then learning their plant family classification can give us indications of the nutrient conditions of our soil. For example, in the Minnesota-Wisconsin area where I live, pigweed, oak leaf goosefoot, and lamb's quarters are all common weeds. All three of these plants are within the Amaranthaceae plant family. Given the location on the infographic, that would indicate a relatively early successional soil, or a low-carbon, high-nitrate soil. So if you see these weeds, perhaps you should consider growing something related to those plants, like spinach or beets. Brassicas prefer a similar environment, so those might work as well. Lettuce grown in a high-nitrate soil can get to be tough or bitter, so that's probably not ideal. Remember, nitrates leach, so nitrates may be higher in a drought, which means weeds might be worse in a drought. In one of my gardens, located in an infertile grass lot, the first year we gardened was a drought. The grass that we tilled in broke down into nitrates in that garden, and since it was a dry year, the nitrates pretty much stayed in place. Despite the infertility, the garden wildly exceeded my expectations that year, mostly because those nitrates hadn't leached away and they were available to the crops. Lamb's quarters was also present that summer, which indicated a higher nitrate content. The second year was wetter, and the fertility was extremely poor. Despite an application of compost, which I discovered was also too low in nitrogen, I didn't see much lamb's quarters on year 2. The only weeds the second year were horsetail and moss, indicating very poor fertility. The garden crops did poorly as well. But knowing the indicator species can really tell you a lot. However, learning the species and what they indicate can be a challenging task, and there's really not a whole lot of great references I can point you to. The infographic can also be used to assist with companion and interplanting and crop rotation. Companion planting is where one crop benefits another, or that they're mutually beneficial. Interplanting means that we're planting crops from different families together to optimize space and time. We can choose crops that prefer a similar soil succession so that both crops are happy with the fertility that we've applied. And crop rotation is the sequence in which different crops are grown. Here are a few ideas for companion planting using the infographic. First, because legumes produce soil nitrogen, they make an excellent companion to brassicas, which are nitrogen hungry. The legendary Dave Brandt, a man of honest work, spoke about his success using this method. He grew alternating rows of tillage radish and winter peas as a cover crop to add organic matter, but also to deal with the hard pan issues in his soil. Instead of tilling or plowing his field to deal with the hard pan, he used tillage radish to break up his compaction layer. The tillage was fueled by the nitrogen produced by the winter pea. The radish grew larger than they otherwise would have because of the nitrogen produced by the peas. And the peas put out more root nodulation because of the nitrogen being used up by the radish. So he added lots of organic matter to the soil and dealt with compaction issues simultaneously. No extra tractor fuel needed, no seat time, no tillage implement needed, all through an ingenious use of companion planting. Other nitrogen-hungry crops like spinach can benefit from legumes in the same way. One other interplanting or crop rotation that I've used in my personal garden are lettuce and carrots. Lettuce grow quickly and carrots grow slowly, so it's possible to get a lettuce crop while the carrots are just getting going. They can be grown in the same bed which has been treated with the same compost, since they both like a relatively higher carbon, lower nitrogen tree leaf-based compost, which I can produce in abundance. So these two crops grow exceptionally well in my garden. One interplanting that won't work so well are brassicas and carrots. Either you provide too much nitrogen to the carrots in keeping the brassicas going, or you deprive the brassicas of nitrogen by keeping the carrots going. Carrots with excess nitrogen will grow large green tops and minimal roots, and brassicas mulched with higher carbon materials will be stunted and sickly. Many vegetables are somewhat forgiving in their preferred compost, but I've found that these two are not so forgiving. Notice that they're spread pretty far apart on the infographic. Even further apart on the infographic are row crops and orchard trees. They're on opposite ends of the carbon to nitrogen spectrum and thrive in different ecosystems. Okay, so what about alley cropping? Mark Shepard here is shown growing alternating rows of nut trees and asparagus. However, I would say they are in wide separated beds, which could allow for precise application of fertility. Wood chips could be applied to the trees only, and compost or nitrogen could be applied to the asparagus only. The tree leaves that fall in the autumn will, however, cover the asparagus beds to some degree and add some level of carbon mulch, which may need to be offset by an application of nitrogen. Another example of rule number 1 and poor planning that I've seen are of orchard trees that have been planted into fields that produce amazing grass. If you have land that wants to produce vigorous grass, then take advantage of that grass instead of fighting it. Get livestock to eat that grass. Sell the hay, anything other than trees. This will forever be an uphill battle. The soil ecosystem contains a lower fungal-to-bacterial ratio and carbon to nitrogen ratio than the trees thrive in, and a much higher nitrate content than trees prefer. Plus, you'll be spending too much time and money mowing that grass down and fighting it. The tall grass will also house pests like voles, which cause even more problems for your trees. Some grass will always be an issue, but providing a wood chip mulch around the base of the trees will help in multiple ways. Wood chips will help by feeding the tree and fungi what they want. Wood chips will help by depriving the grass of the nitrogen it wants. Wood chips help by retaining moisture around the root of the tree. Wood chips help by removing pest habitat around the base of the tree. Obviously, procuring enough wood chips to feed an entire orchard can be challenging, if not impossible, especially if your soil is already high in nitrogen. Those wood chips will break down rapidly, and soon you'll need even more wood chips. See rule number 1. We'll look at some more real-world examples throughout this YouTube channel. Here's a theoretical example of a multi-year crop rotation that emulates a natural succession. The first year could involve growing legumes, which will fix nitrogen into tired soils. This could be combined with a dose of nitrogen to give your soil even more of a boost. The second year, brassicas will thrive on that large dose of nitrogen that now exists in the soil. By the third year, some of those nitrates will have been used up or will have leached out. If there's still enough left in the soil, a less nitrogen-hungry crop could be planted, such as potatoes, tomatoes, or cucumbers. Assuming the plant waste is continually returned to the soil, so there still should be carbon feeding the soil from the previous crop. By year 4, a low nitrogen crop like carrots, parsnips, or lettuce could be grown. In theory, this type of rotation reduces the need for yearly nitrogen inputs and minimizes compost needs. All right, so let's take a little closer look at carbon to nitrogen math because it can be confusing, difficult, and imprecise. Our goal is to mix carbon to nitrogen materials by dry weight. This is hard to estimate if one material is wet and another is dry, or if one is fluffy and one is dense. Tree leaves are obviously very lightweight, large in volume, and contain minimal moisture. Grass clippings from the lawn are often dense and moist, so how can we accurately mix those two together to achieve a specific outcome? Well, it takes some experience to develop an eye and a nose for mixing compost, but most people rely on their experience and not on math or calculations. Because even using a mathematical process involves estimating and room for error. Most gardeners would say don't overthink it, and I would agree. So instead, I'm going to just give you a comprehensive set of guidelines to keep you in the right range, because it's really not that difficult. Let's say our target carbon to nitrogen ratio is 40:1. I have tree leaves and grass clippings that I can use to achieve this ratio. If we take 1 part tree leaves containing a 60:1 ratio and mix it with lush grass clippings with a 16:1 carbon nitrogen ratio, the outcome will have a ratio of 38:1, So a 1-to-1 ratio of leaves and grass is close to my 40-to-1 target. In another example, let's say my target is 30-to-1. I have straw and cow manure. I've calculated that I need 3 parts manure for 1 part straw to achieve my 32-to-1 ratio. Okay, but what does 1 part mean? How do I measure 1 part? What am I measuring? I said dry weight before, but the truth is that it's more complicated than that and nobody really knows. So really, it doesn't matter is my answer. Carbon to nitrogen is more of a numerical reference than a measurable unit. Here are some basic guidelines for estimating carbon to nitrogen ratios. Anything less than 10-to-1 is going to be extremely stinky, slimy, disgusting. It'll break down in days or weeks. It'll probably attract flies or maggots or scavengers. And you absolutely do not want a compost pile in this range. This equates to basically sludge or rotting carcass. So if you're going to use any of these materials in a mixture, they need to be combined with some sort of woody carbon material. So would you want a compost pile in this range? Absolutely not. Could you use these materials as a mulch? No, except urine you can use as a nitrogen fertilizer directly on your soils. Now looking at the 10 to 25-to-1 carbon to nitrogen range, a compost pile in this range will be hot and stinky and nasty. Think wet grass clippings. Think kitchen vegetable scraps. Think cow manure. Still gross stuff that looks like a pile of ickiness. The stinkiness that you're smelling is excess nitrogen being lost to the air in the form of ammonia. That smell might also mean that it's anaerobic. Since it's so wet and heavy, there's little airflow, and we do not want anaerobic compost. If your compost pile falls in this range, you will likely need to add more carbon to the material to keep it aerated and to keep it from stinking. These materials break down in a matter of a few weeks, assuming ideal moisture conditions. These materials can work as a thin layer of mulch since they will not go anaerobic, but too thick of a layer of mulch could be problematic as it could suffocate or smother your soil, and it could stay wet and slimy and breed nastiness. High nitrogen materials are always volatile, so some of the nitrogen may be lost to the air. 25 to 50-to-1 carbon to nitrogen range. This is the ideal range for most row and vegetable crops. Again, 30-to-1 is the general target to shoot for. It can be tweaked higher or lower depending on your crop preference. Generally, a compost pile in this range won't go anaerobic and won't stink, but turning a compost pile and aerating it can speed up the decomposition. A pile in this range will still heat up significantly, especially on the lower end of this range. These materials can break down in about 5 to 10 weeks in a pile or as mulch. The hotter and more aerated the pile, the faster it'll break down. But remember, mulching creates a slow release of fertility, which is good. To achieve this range often requires mixing materials together, or mid-range or midlife crops and grasses live in this range. So a terminated cover crop at the right time could create a mulch in this range as well. Observing how quickly these materials break down on your soil as a mulch can indicate your soil's carbon to nitrogen ratio. I want to focus on this range specifically for a minute because this range is special. I'll call it the dynamic vegetative range. Let's take a pasture, for example, and look at grass. This also applies to cereal grasses as well. Young vegetative grasses are tender and delicate. They start their lives with a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 15-to-1. Their carbon to nitrogen ratio increases gradually as they become taller, stockier, and more carbon dense. At the end of the season, the grass becomes what we consider to be straw, which turns brown and becomes old, stiff, and crunchy like old people, with a carbon to nitrogen ratio of around 70-to-1. So over the course of one growing season, some pasture plants have extended the entire length of this carbon to nitrogen range. This may be important to consider when terminating a cover crop. If left undisturbed, the snowfall will press the straw to the ground, effectively mulching the pasture with straw. This will increase the carbon to nitrogen ratio and progress the ecosystem succession. Now, in a grassland, cattle are periodically pruning some of the grass, which prevents some of it from turning to straw. That keeps the grass in the rapid growth stage, the steepest part of the yellow curve. This also happens to be around the 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. The grass that does turn to straw will likely get trampled by the cattle, again, effectively mulching the pasture with straw. Cattle also pee and poop, which provide a nitrogen boost, which shifts the carbon to nitrogen to the left. So, the periodic disturbance by the cattle grazing and trampling and defecating and urinating keeps the grass in a state of vigorous growth. Cattle disturbance prevents the ecosystem from progressing to the brush stage and keeps the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the soil near the sweet spot. Grass loves cattle and cattle loves grass. They evolved together. This is why domesticated grasses, such as cereal crops, require regular nitrogen applications. The activity of cattle exercises the grass, but exercise requires rest. That's why rotational grazing produces strong pastures, because it emulates natural grasslands with an oscillating sine wave of exercise and rest, exercise and rest. If you spent 24/7 in the gym, you wouldn't come out any stronger. You'd come out ragged and scrawny and exhausted. That's what a lot of cattle do to pastures when they're not managed properly. Legumes are also special because not only do they fix nitrogen into the soil, but they generally don't get stocky like grasses. So legumes die off at a 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen as opposed to, say, a 60-to-1 like straw, and leave a residue that slows ecosystem succession and benefits grasses. That's why legumes make a great companion to grasses. Okay, back to our carbon to nitrogen ratios. The 50 to 100 range breaks down in about a half to a full growing season as a mulch, or over a year in a pile. The difference is because nitrogen from the soil will assist in decomposition, whereas that nitrogen is not available in a compost pile. A compost pile in this range won't heat up and won't get stinky at all. Just think of like a pile of straw or a pile of tree leaves or peat moss. But if you're mulching with these types of materials, which is common, like straw, gauging how quickly that straw breaks down can give you some indication of how much nitrogen you have in your soil. If you go a full year and you still see straw, assuming decent moisture content, then you're probably lacking in nitrogen. Anything over 100 to 1 ratio is going to take longer than 1 full year to break down as a mulch, and much longer than that in a compost pile. Possibly even materials in this range may possibly even take decades or more to break down. Think of wood chips or logs in the forest or wood shavings, newspaper, cardboard, stuff like that. Generally, you can have a pile of this stuff and call it a compost pile, but it's really not going to be composting at all unless you start adding nitrogen to it. And generally, the only time I use materials from this category are for smothering grass, or I use wood chips on my garden pathways, or I would use wood chips as a mulch around trees. That covers the range of carbon to nitrogen ratios, but here's a few more just general guidelines or different ways of thinking about it. Brown materials can be thought of as a pile bulking agent. Like, this is going to provide the bulk of your compost pile. And then you'd add green materials as an activator to speed up the decomposition of the bulking agent. If you have a pile of wood chips, it probably ain't going anywhere for many, many years. But if you start adding urine to that compost pile, you're going to start activating and speeding up the decomposition as you shift the carbon to nitrogen ratio closer to that 30 to 1 range. So if you've got material that's breaking down too quickly, then you'll want to add some browns to the mix. If you got material that's not breaking down at all, you'll want to add greens to the mix. Greens will speed up decomposition. Browns will slow decomposition. You can think of browns as a sort of slow food and greens as a sort of fast food. Brown materials will provide aeration if you're lacking aeration. Brown materials will prevent odors if you're noticing odors. Brown materials will feed fungi. Brown materials will be dry or crumbly or hard. Green materials will heat up a compost pile as it activates it, but too much green materials will be odor-inducing and will feed bacteria. Too much green material can be wet, soft, and slimy. When considering carbon to nitrogen ratios, you need to consider the carbon to nitrogen ratio that currently exists in your soil, as well as your crop's preferred carbon to nitrogen ratio, as well as the carbon to nitrogen residue of your mulch, compost, or cover crop material. I want to just relate carbon to nitrogen ratio to organic matter, because the organic matter in the soil has a particular carbon to nitrogen ratio. If you don't have any organic matter in your soil, then you don't have a carbon to nitrogen ratio. It's possible to have a soil with 1% organic matter that has a 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. And it's also possible to have a 10% organic matter soil at a 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. Although I would express it differently. I would express it as a 300-to-10 parts carbon to nitrogen ratio, just to think about it conceptually. They have the same proportion of carbon to nitrogen, but more total carbon to nitrogen exists in a higher organic matter soil. This is important to consider because it's relevant to point number 4 on the instructions. Let me illustrate with an example. Let's compare 3 soils. One with a 1% organic matter soil, another with 5% organic matter, and another with 10% organic matter. Let's say they each have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 30-to-1. If I add 1 part leaf mulch with a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 60-to-1 to each of the 3 soils, look at how the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the 3 soils is shifted. The 1% soil organic matter now has a 45-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. The intermediate soil has a 35-to-1 ratio, and the 10% soil organic matter soil has a 32-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. The richer soils have a certain momentum that takes more energy to change. Lessons. Low organic matter soils are volatile. It takes very little organic matter to change the ratio, so you must be more careful about the balance during the buildup phase. Example, putting wood chip mulch on an infertile vegetable garden will create radical nitrogen deficiency. High organic matter soils are stable. It takes more organic matter to shift the carbon to nitrogen ratio. In other words, changing the soil ecosystem is more difficult. Example, turning a rich grassland pasture into an orchard will require huge amounts of wood chips to shift the carbon to nitrogen ratio to suit the apple trees and stifle the grass. Turning a forest ecosystem into a productive pasture will require huge amounts of nitrogen to shift the soil carbon to nitrogen to suppress the brush growth and encourage the grass growth. This goes back to rule number 1, grow what already wants to grow. With that being said, there is a time and a place for altering the soil ecosystem. Altering the soil carbon to nitrogen ratio can be achieved through additive or subtractive means. Most often, additive methods are what we should aim for, but not always. Here's what I mean. For example, if you're trying to turn a duff or brush area into a pasture or cropland, like the first image, first you may need to knock down the brush, probably with mechanical means. Chopping it up will create basically a wood chip mulch, and the soil will still contain high levels of carbon, but at least you've stressed the brush and gotten it out of the way. Remember, disturbance can be used to shift the soil ecosystem backwards. Following that up with a one-time tillage will have a couple effects. First, it will oxidize some of the soil carbon and reduce the soil's carbon content. It will also disrupt the fungal networks that support the brush's regrowth. More on this later. Again, disturbance can be used to shift the soil ecosystem backwards, but the cost is reduced organic matter. At this point, we'd want to shift toward adding nitrogen to the soil through livestock urine and manure, or other means, which will further serve to support the grass and suppress the brush. So once we've achieved our roughly 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, it can most likely be maintained through additive means alone, typically through applications of nitrogen, since the grass and forbs will produce their own carbon. Here's another way of looking at it. What we're trying to do is basically change the soil carbon to nitrogen ratio from 80-to-1 to 30-to-1. Step 1. Mow the brush down. This stresses the brush, lets light in, and preps for tillage. But we haven't really changed the carbon to nitrogen ratio yet. When we till, we further disturb the brush, we disturb the fungal networks, and we oxidize or subtract carbon, which might bring our carbon to nitrogen ratio down to, say, roughly 60-to-1. Step 3, we add nitrogen. So now, instead of a 60-to-1 ratio, we have a 60-to-2 ratio, or 30-to-1 ratio. In this case, the chicken manure from our chicken tractors is providing that concentrated form of natural nitrogen. In theory, we don't need to mow or till the brush to kill it. We could simply achieve this by adding nitrogen to the soil. But adding large doses of nitrogen to that type of situation may or may not be possible for you. And depending on what your goal is, getting the brush knocked down and out of the way may be preferable. But again, if you can find a way to just simply add a bunch of nitrogen to that brush setting, that might be all you need. If you can find a way to do that without mowing or tilling, the benefit is that we preserve some of the organic matter and soil carbon in the soil. But again, soil organic matter doesn't accumulate indefinitely. It'll find a natural equilibrium. Now we're going to take a look at the soil health principles and why they're important. So I've borrowed and combined the soil health principles from a few different places, but they're basically the same. We'll dive into each and emphasize why they're so important so that you can make better management decisions. These are in no particular order, by the way. Number 1, keep soil covered with living plants and or mulch. If you had to choose one or the other, living plants are preferable to mulch, since they will eventually become mulch anyway. But you really should strive for both at all times. First, let's talk mulch. You've heard all the benefits before, but let's really dig into these because there are so many benefits and they're so important, but I know people personally who aren't yet convinced that it's that important. So one of the first key points is less maintenance, and this is a big point. Mulch preserves moisture, which reduces the need for watering systems, and hand watering, which saves water, time, money, and infrastructure. Water keeps your crops hydrated, but also fed. Because moisture also keeps the microbes alive, which speeds the decomposition, which speeds nutrient production, which speeds plant growth. Again, moisture keeps your crops hydrated and fed. A second point on less maintenance. Mulch prevents weeds. Weeds siphon nutrients and moisture away from your crop. Not seeing weeds also calms your itch to get the tiller out. And we'll look at why over-tillage is bad in a minute. This means you don't need to hand weed either. You want to make sure your mulch isn't filled with weed seeds, by the way. And even if it is, more mulch will keep those seeds from taking over. I'm talking deep mulch. Another point on less maintenance. Compost piles are much more maintenance compared to mulch. Nature herself creates mulch, not compost piles, because mulch is more efficient. Having a pile is great, but mulch will compost in place and slow release those nutrients to the plants over time while preserving moisture and preventing weeds at the same time. With mulch, a small batch of compost tea is made every time it rains. That's great, because who has time for compost tea? Compost tea is a cute idea with niche applications, but most of us don't have the need or time for it. Applying finished compost to a garden will provide a bunch of nutrients all at once, but if there are no living plants in the ground, a lot of those nutrients will just leach away at the first rainfall. Viewed through the lens of the 8 wastes of lean production, mulch is drastically more efficient than compost piling. Mulch prevents wasted motion, wasted transportation, overprocessing, excess inventory, and wait time. Study the 8 wastes of lean. Mulch also feeds the soil life, which keeps the soil biology alive. Soil biology creates good soil, not tillers. So feed the soil microbes. Plus, mulch implies that you're importing organic matter and increasing organic matter faster. The next big point on mulch is that it prevents erosion. So even if you do have good quality, high organic matter soil, mulch will keep that good stuff from eroding away. Mulch also regulates soil temperature. Microbes and plant roots like a climate-controlled environment, just like you. That's why when you see plants growing in pots above ground, on a sidewalk, or in a bucket, they just never tend to do well because the entire root structure is in a pot that is changing temperature drastically from day to night. Mulch also reduces compaction. Side note, you should never walk on your garden beds. You need to separate your walkways from your garden beds. In fact, that's rule number 2, never walk on the garden beds. Think of your soil as its own huge organism, or as one big digestive system. When I look at my garden, the whole garden, I think of it as a digestive system. Living plants exercise your soil. Dead stuff feeds your soil. Living plants can't grow well if they are not constantly well fed and hydrated. Just like you can't exercise very well if you're not constantly well fed and hydrated. Mulching isn't just a cute idea. Mulching is essential. You need it, and you need it now. The secret to no-till gardening is mulch. Pastures create their own mulch. Cropping systems do too if you leave it in place and you learn to work around it. Gardens and orchards are the most obvious candidates for mulch. But make sure you're mulching with the right materials for your crop according to the infographic. For example, mulching brassicas with wood chips will do more harm than good, as I've said multiple times. Mulching raspberries with tree leaves, on the other hand, is exactly what the infographic ordered. We're still on point number 1 here. We talked about mulch. Mulch is only helpful to living plants. Keeping living plants growing at all times is equally important. Think of cover crops as a living mulch. Living mulch has many of the same benefits as dead mulch, so if you can't import mulch, then grow it yourself as a cover crop. Leave the residue from your plants in place to feed your soil. Living mulch becomes dead mulch. Mulching alone isn't going to build amazing soil structure. Living plants are needed as well. Dead mulch sits on top of the soil. Living mulch digs down deep and adds organic matter deeper into the soil when it dies. Living plants also encourage different forms of microbes than dead mulch. Seeing brown dirt baking in the sun with no greenery just irritates my soul, because I know that my soil microbes are dying off. The sun and the wind and exposure are stressful to my microbes. And my microbes are my employees. They're working for me. I need to keep them fat and happy. If my microbes are hungry, sunburnt, dehydrated and dying off, well, then my plants will be too. And by extension, I will be hungry and dying off. Ideally, I'd like to never see the surface of my soil. To put it simply, think of your soil as its own organism with its own digestive system. The dead mulch on the soil is how much food is left on the dinner plate. The living plants are the soil's productive output. If the dinner plate is empty, your soil's getting hungry and won't be as productive, meaning plants won't grow as vigorously. Think of green materials as fast foods and brown materials as slow foods on your dinner plate. Soil health principle number 2, reduce soil disturbance. Tilling can be an invaluable tool. When I say that, I mean use tillage strategically, intelligently, and rarely, and not compulsively. Instead of tilling, think additive, not subtractive. What weeds are you dealing with? What organic matter can you add to the soil to reduce weed pressure? Remember that mulch is a key tool in the fight against weeds. Disturbance or tillage reverses ecosystem succession by disrupting fungi in the fungal-to-bacterial ratio, by oxidizing organic carbon in the carbon-to-nitrogen ratio. And over-tillage encourages weeds because you're setting the ecosystem succession so far back. Tilling is a doom vortex. Tilling is a vicious cycle. You till to kill weeds, but tilling creates an ideal habitat for weeds, so more weeds grow. So you need to till again, so more weeds grow. So you need to till again, so more weeds grow. So you need to till again. You till to loosen your soil, but you're destroying soil structure, so you need to till again. But you're destroying soil structure, so you need to till again. But you're destroying soil structure, so you need to till again. And so on until you just give up in disgust. Most apparent benefits of tilling are short-term. Focus on the long term. Plants and worms will dig and till. Microbes will build the aerated structure, but you have to let them. Why till? Why buy a tiller, waste the time maintaining the tiller, waste the time tilling the garden, waste the time putting gas in it, waste the gas? Mulch is the better alternative. Let me share an example. My grandpa was a much better fisherman than gardener. He would till at least 3 times a year and occasionally bring in a load of turkey manure for fertility. After fertilizing, weeds would explode in his garden, which required more tilling. He always complained that the fertilizer was full of weed seeds, but more likely he was simply creating conditions ideal for weed seeds that were already in his garden. After a decade or more of gardening in this way, the soil became like concrete and it grows nothing but the worst weeds. 10 years of gardening should leave the soil better, not worse. The brown swath in the image is the corner of his garden in the early spring. You can also see some farm fields in the background. I never like to see my garden be browner and deader than the surrounding vegetation. His garden suffered from over-tillage, excess nitrogen, and a lack of fungi and carbon. Mycorrhizal fungi have a special symbiotic relationship to plants. These fungi act as an extension of the plant roots. They're finer and can get between the soil pores more easily. They also extend the reach of the roots. Ever wonder how a beet or a carrot can get all the nutrients without having finer roots? These fungi are critical in so many ways to the plant's health. Remember soil health principle number 1? Keep living plants in the ground. Well, living plants feed the fungi, and the fungi feed the plant. But fungi are extremely sensitive to disturbance. Here's an analogy. Think of your soil like a city. In a city, you have buildings which are full of habitable areas. You've got drainage canals for runoff, sewage systems, transportation networks, recycling facilities, communication networks, etc. The soil is like a city in that it has its own civilization of microbes along with critical infrastructure. The fungal networks are the roads and bridges that move stuff around. Soil microbes and living plants are the construction crew that build the soil structure. Dead organic matter is the building material that builds the soil structure. Soil structure is full of air canals, water canals, microbe dwellings, wormholes, etc. Imagine a hurricane destroys the entire city. Buildings are destroyed. Where will we live? How will we do business? Roads are destroyed. How will we rebuild if we can't get new building materials into the city? Destroying the fungal networks are like destroying the roads in our cities. Cities are very sensitive to road disturbance. How much do you like road construction? We would not be a very productive city if a hurricane came along every year and wiped out the city. The few survivors would probably just abandon the city. You can obviously see how not disturbing the city with a hurricane allows the city to remain at peak efficiency. You and your tiller are like a hurricane to the soil structure. You're destroying the city and the workforce that builds it. You're sabotaging transportation networks that move material around. And you're burning the building materials. Tilling is fine if that's your intention, but doing so compulsively probably isn't ideal. Another point worth mentioning is the relationship between soil carbon and atmospheric carbon. Most farmland is deficient in organic matter because of overtillage and overgrazing. Degraded cropland has about a 1% organic matter. The average U.S. cropland is about 1.5%. Regenerative farms and healthy cropland are more than double that at about 4% soil organic matter. Native grasslands and undisturbed soils, however, are about 8% or better. Soil organic matter is one of the planet's biggest natural carbon sinks. However, land degradation and overtillage release stored soil carbon and increase atmospheric carbon. By adopting regenerative practices like cover crops, no-till, and rotational grazing, we can improve soil resilience and climate resilience simultaneously. However, croplands require very careful management and will almost always deteriorate soil health. The real solution to regenerating soils is to return them to perennial pastures. Worth mentioning is what I call the agro-pastoral soil bank cycle. Somebody else out there might have a better name for it. I won't go deep into it here, but the cycle works as follows. Soil nutrients accumulate over time with pastoral systems. Think of bison or cattle grazing on a grassland. Soil nutrients are extracted over time with agricultural cropping systems like grains. The U.S. Corn Belt has rich soils because of the bison grazing grasslands for centuries or millennia. But row crops tend to deplete the soils because they're heavy feeders and require plowing and tillage. Agricultural systems also have a harder time replacing soil nitrogen that livestock would otherwise provide. Synthetic nitrogen has made this easier and allowed the continuation of agricultural crop production for much longer than it otherwise could have. Normally, we'd have to let these fields return to pasture and graze them for a few years and then plow them up again in the future once soil nutrients have sufficiently accumulated. Historically, prior to synthetic fertilizers, a multi-year rotation is what balanced cropping systems with pastoral systems. Inevitably, we will have to return to these systems. Soil health principle number 3. Use natural materials and reduce synthetics. Natural amendments are like natural food. Your body knows how to use natural products. They're wholesome and still intact. They keep you healthy. Natural foods taste better. If junk food wasn't convenient, you'd prefer real food. If microbes could talk, they'd tell you that pea tastes better than Miracle-Gro. Do you prefer natural lighting or artificial lighting? Do you prefer sitting in front of a campfire or sitting in front of a noisy metal HVAC system? Do you prefer the aesthetic of a log cabin or the aesthetic of the cement walls of an institution? The difference between man-made and nature-made is spiritual and tangible, not some hippy-dippy bullcrap. Artificial amendments deliver quick nutrient boosts, but they create an addiction scenario where they need to be constantly reapplied. It's like you being fed nutrients through an IV tube rather than through eating real food. You'd need a constant dose because you've circumvented the entire biological process behind digestion. With that being said, there are major advantages to something like synthetic nitrogen. In the previous slide, I mentioned that it allows for easier application without the need for the hassle of livestock. In general, treat synthetics as a rare supplement to be used in small amounts with great care and great intelligence. Proper soil management should render them mostly unnecessary, and natural methods should be consulted first. As a minor supplement, they can help fill a few gaps. The problem is when our entire civilization is built entirely on synthetics. It creates a fragile system and a fragile civilization. Synthetic materials can create soil imbalances that manifest in an infinite number of negative ways, just like when you eat denatured junk food. It manifests in an infinite number of health issues. Healthy soil equals healthy plants equals healthy animals equals healthy people equals healthy institutions equals healthy planet. Are soils healthy right now? Are people healthy right now? Are institutions healthy right now? Are people eating natural or artificial food? Are soil microbes eating natural or artificial food? The foundation of healthy human institutions is soil. Civilizational health is tied directly to soil health, and both are degenerating at this moment in history. Soil health principle number 4, increase diversity. Many growers only grow corn and soybeans. This is not a diversity of plants. Imagine your diet consisting only of rice and beans forever. No meat, no fruit, no milk, no spices, no oil, just plain rice and beans. You would soon tire of these foods. Your health would deteriorate until disease or malnourishment takes over. The soil is like a digestive system that requires a diversity of plants. A large-scale, prolonged diet of only corn and soybeans is destroying that once vibrant, diverse grassland ecosystem of the central U.S., and biodiversity is collapsing because of it. Modern agricultural systems are a lower-order, higher-entropy system, sacrificing everything in the name of energy density. Soil biology, plants, ecosystems all require a range of nutrients, vitamins, physical characteristics to survive. The easiest way to integrate diversity is to return to perennial pasture-based agriculture. The cow that produced my milk eats from a wide range of pasture plants. The cow's diverse diet is embedded within the milk that I drink. The bees that produce my honey gather a variety of nectars. The bee's diverse diet is embedded within the honey I eat. So when I combine milk and honey, I'm only eating 2 ingredients, but there is great diversity embedded within that system. And I don't care who you are, I know for a fact that you prefer ice cream over rice and beans. Within a row crop system, diversity is increasingly difficult to integrate as the management complexity increases. But there are some things we can do, like interplanting, companion planting, and cover cropping. Monocropping can work for short periods of time, but diversify over time, mix warm and cool season crops, add diverse mulches and composts. Choose as wide a range of each that works within your context. And it must be economical and sustainable too. Don't stress about over-diversifying because, again, diversification is very difficult in the context of cropping systems. Soil health principle number 5, know your context. Now, this sounds kind of vague, and it can mean a lot of different things. I've linked a few articles written on this subject for greater detail, but the main point is what works for you in your area with your resources. I'll highlight a few key points. First, consider your background ecology, bioregion, or biome. I've already mentioned this before, but I would say this is kind of the foundation of the pyramid. This will have the biggest effect on the following factors. Again, ask yourself these questions. What did the land produce before agriculture? Finding out what nature had produced there prior to man's intervention will give us the biggest clues as to the path of least resistance. Climate would be the next point to consider. I don't need to explain to old farmers climate factors like precipitation, frost dates, and all this, but if you are on a small scale or homestead type of operation, it's much easier to find or create microclimates. This could enable greater diversity of production if you learn to work within the smaller pockets within your land base. Permaculturists often talk about this. For me, a major consideration is that the growing season is very short, about 110 days on average from frost to frost. Barely enough time to eke out some warm season crops like winter squash or sweet corn. On a bad year, I probably can't grow these things. I can lengthen the growing season with plastic coverings like a hoop house, or by starting seeds indoors early in the season. That might work for a garden or a small farm, but probably not a large farm. I don't have access to plastic, so I mostly choose not to grow those crops, or I may just take the risk that they're not going to mature. My other option is that I just buy seed starch from a nursery, from somebody else who has plastic. The last thing I would want to do is try to build a business off of growing crops that has a chance of being frosted out on any given year. The odds of success are too low since there are already way too many other risks besides. The next thing to consider is the current soil succession. This will initially be determined by your background ecology, and second, by prior management. This relates back to step 4 of the instructions. The two main components are soil organic matter percentage and carbon to nitrogen ratio. What's your starting point? How can you increase organic matter, and how can you do so with the proper carbon to nitrogen balance? Where does it need to be to suit your intended crop? The closer they are at the start, the easier time you're going to have as a farmer. The next considerations are warm and cool season crops. Here's a look at what my seasonal plant growth curve looks like. In my context, I can almost exclusively grow cool season crops throughout the entire growing season, as hot spells are rare and short-lived. My climate is tempered by Lake Superior. Warm season crops can be hit or miss, and they can't safely be planted until June 1st, which leaves 4 weeks prior when cool season crops could be growing. That's a long time to not be growing something. Consider mixing warm and cool season crops in your crop rotation or companion plantings to get the most out of your land base. And finally, local resources. In my example, if I want to grow tomatoes, I'm going to need to get them started early. So my options are invest in plastic coverings or indoor grow lights, or just buy the starts from somebody who's already done that. In my case, I don't own property, so investing in a hoop house or greenhouse is not ideal. I've tried indoor grow lights, and I find that it never works for me, and I've lost my patience in it. Besides, we barely eat any tomatoes anyway, so growing a lot of tomatoes isn't worth it. So in my case, I choose to buy about 6 to 8 tomato plants from the nursery, and that's all me and my neighbors want. Do what works for you in your local context. Some of this seems obvious, but really considering these things at depth prior to starting a farm or garden can really help set you up for success in the long run. This concludes the soil health principles segment of the presentation. There are just a few other things I'll cover before I wrap this up. I want to circle back to soil texture and make a few points about how soil texture can affect soil succession and some of the strategies to consider. Firstly, soil health principles will do you well no matter what your soil texture is. But the most common problematic soils are sand dominant and clay dominant. The characteristics of sandy soils is that it's very loose, which means it has good airflow and good drainage. But the looseness means that these soils dry out quickly. So using a mulch to preserve moisture can be beneficial. And it's preferred by mycorrhizal fungi because of the large pore space and airflow, which better supports later successional crops. Sandy soils can usually be decompacted easily. Another option is that deep-rooted plants will have an easier time because of the looseness getting down deeper and accessing moisture. Sandy soils also leach nitrates easily. So not only does it naturally promote mycorrhizal fungi because of its looseness, but it also naturally sheds nitrates. Both factors promote a later successional crop. Because of the leachability of these types of soils, perhaps consider a legume companion if you're looking to grow a higher nitrogen crop. Sandy soils are prone to erosion, so ensuring that we keep living roots in the soil and keeping the soil mulched can greatly help with erosion issues. Clay soils, on the other hand, are very heavy and very dense, which means they tend to hold moisture, which can be beneficial in a drought, but they can get waterlogged when wet. When dry, they can become almost like concrete. The benefit of this density and poor drainage is that clay soils hold nitrates. This can be good or bad. Be careful not to over-apply nitrogen to heavy clay soils, as it will tend to accumulate and promote weedy growth, like my grandpa's garden I showed you earlier. Clay soils are prone to compaction, so minimizing foot or tractor traffic would be a good idea. Minimizing tilling, which will destroy the existing soil structure. Because of the density, soil structure takes longer to build with clay soils, so therefore it's more important not to ruin it by tilling. Clay soils also have a higher thermal mass, which warms up later in the spring and cools off later in the fall. Some strategies for clay soils include growing early successional crops because of the ability to hold nitrates. Mulch is always a good idea. Conclusion and summary. So what about macronutrients like NPK? What about micronutrients, cation exchange capacity, soil tests, and the elliptical position of Saturn? I'm not saying to completely ignore these things altogether, or maybe I am. Many people like to radically overcomplicate things, and I hope I haven't done that here. Instead, I think if you focus on these 3 points, you'll be 80% of the way there. If you have issues that persist, my first advice would be to restudy these 3 points and dig deeper. And the 3 key points are the soil health principles, soil organic matter percentage, and carbon to nitrogen ratio. Focus on increasing your organic matter, but doing so with your intended carbon to nitrogen balance. The crop preference section of this infographic will evolve over time. I have many thoughts on this, but I hope the general trend is clear to see. There are many variables that I have yet to figure out how to embed into this infographic. Some plants are heavy feeders, some are light feeders. Some have a wider carbon to nitrogen tolerance. Some are warm season, some are cool season. Plants within the same family might have different requirements. There are a lot of berry species besides those I have listed, and there are a lot of orchard trees that could probably be listed. My hope is that by publishing this, it will spark conversation, and then smarter people than me will come along and help to provide some feedback and help to contribute to this section of the chart. If you're a professional who feels you could contribute your expertise, consider leaving a revision or a comment by scanning the QR code. You can also contact me this way. Hopefully you'll consider following the YouTube channel and Facebook page as well. Okay, see you later.